I'm honored to introduce Dean Milton Curry. Milton has systematically migrated west across this country for the past 27 years, with a brief detour through Arizona, if I'm not mistaken, from the GSD to teaching positions at Cornell, then as an associate dean at the University of Michigan, and now the Della and Harry McDonald Dean's Chair in Architecture at the University of Southern California. Milton's work as an educator, architect, and thinker has focused on the complex exchanges between urbanism, race, class, and modernity. As part of this intellectual project, he has founded 2 academic journals, Appendix and Critical Productive, and as the dean at USC, he has challenged his students to rethink the foundational questions about architecture and their agency under the framework Citizen Architect. Please join me in welcoming Milton Curry to give the inaugural annual meeting address.
Thank you, Paul. And thank you, Rosalie Ginevro and the board. First of all, congratulations on the great work that you guys are doing. It's fantastic to see institutions really taking up the mantle of transformative change, and I applaud those efforts and look forward to participating in some of the future events. And thank you for the board, to the board for inviting me. It's a real honor to be here and to try to start a conversation with you this evening. I bring greetings from the left coast. You're supposed to laugh. So the world and the planet that we are occupying today face many pressures that many of you, most of you are probably in this room well aware of. Societies across the globe are struggling with the predominance of market capitalism, increasing prosperity, and increasing inequality. Diverse populations and nations are dealing with the legacies of colonialism, discrimination, racism, and the vestiges of pre-modern exclusionary societies, resulting in refugee crises, political destabilization, and renewed violence. Cities and metropolitan regions within our own country and hemisphere are struggling to provide basic provisions of housing, urban infrastructure, and meaningful work in the age of AI and increasing anxieties about the future of work. Architecture's estrangement from the political, an ideological estrangement that affects the discipline and practice of architecture, has become an impediment to the development of a collective voice to address these issues. The version of the political to which I'm referring is an Arendtian version, whereby citizens are in active engagement with the communities and relationships that organize and govern their status as fellow persons. An estrangement that exceeds the limits of any formal institutional affiliations with political parties or the state. Architecture and urbanism should generate a world in which the meaning of space is integral to the meaning of one's own lived experience, where the value of space is, in fact, an enactment of the values of the society. As a collective, we have a long way to go to actually live up to this extraordinary aspiration. Despite the exemplary projects executed by many of us in this room and our colleagues, our discipline is best known today for its service of the 1%. And this is a gap in public trust, confidence, and perception, a gap in our own theoretical formulations and on-the-ground realities, a gap in how we as architects and academics see our own roles in advancing particular kinds of cultural production, from ideological, disciplinary, and professional perspectives. To bridge this gap, I'm going to consider the state of the discipline in 3 relatively short observational essays. The first, redefining egalitarianism. The second, the role of academia in cultural production. And the third, the role of architecture praxis in cultural production. Redefining egalitarianism. The egalitarian turn is my own optimistic assessment of our current socio-political condition, based on a redefinition of John Rawls's theory of justice, updated to address our current moment. When, not if, but when we turn from current trends towards authoritarianism and totalitarianism globally, we will have an opportunity to create a more egalitarian framework for our future. Elizabeth Anderson, professor of philosophy at the University of Michigan, states, quote, "Cities are key sites where the increasingly diverse denizens of states learn how to relate to each other. Urban design helps determine whether they will relate to each other as equals or as dominant and subordinate, privileged and disadvantaged, honored and stigmatized, insiders and outcasts. From an egalitarian point of view, urban planners need to be sensitive not only to the ways urban infrastructure distributes public goods across spaces occupied by residents of diverse identities, but also how urban design facilitates or blocks the circulation of people, ideas, cultural practices, and material goods across heterogeneous neighborhoods." End quote. As the focus has shifted from nation states to cities, new questions have emerged as to whether the metropolis is even governable. The new formulations that we have all heard, the smart city, the resilient city, the sustainable city, the intelligent city, and climate change, in the end fail because they privilege the managerial class to define problems and dictate solutions. Why not privilege persons? Why not describe citizens as central to any systemic transformation of our cities? In metropolitan Detroit from 2010 to 2017, I personally witnessed the failure of democratic institutions and the managerial class to safeguard fundamental human rights. I witnessed architecture's complicity with pragmatic capital and the managerial class to normalize economic violence, sculpting away the capacity of cities to govern, draining them of the capital needed to provide basic services, appropriating democratic rights and delivering those rights to the wealth class, privatizing public goods, and cynically using the promise of reimagined public space to compensate for the evacuation of economic value from working class and poor neighborhoods. That is a legacy of the Detroit comeback and the resulting collateral damage from the largest municipal bankruptcy in the nation's history. Despite the marketing, Detroit is an exemplary tale of two cities. When democratic institutions fail and when the state fails to do its job, where do citizens go to compensate for the lack of engagement? Cultural institutions are in fact one vehicle that citizens use to build up social capital, particularly when trying to compensate for a lack of financial capital and power. Most of us would agree, most of us in this room would agree, I hope, that expanding the reach of culture to a broad constituency of publics is a common good. Most of us would agree that expanding rights and democratic participation in culture and politics is enriching to all of society. We might agree that this expansive cultural exposure has a promise of leveling the playing field and empowering all citizens towards a more egalitarian future. In New York, in Los Angeles, and in many other cities and counties, culture is reaching diverse constituencies. And the definition of culture is expanding, has expanded beyond art museums and opera to sports entertainment and gaming. Cultural institutions have transformed from elite spaces of consumption to diverse spaces of free exhibitions, convenings, performances, education, research, yoga, and TED Talks. Appealing to audiences ranging from children to seniors, LGBTQ and diverse ability communities, the Shed, the Cooper Hewitt, the Museum of Modern Art, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, Art and Practice, the Underground Museum, and countless other smaller and community-based arts and cultural organizations are changing the way the average citizen participates in culture. But the democratization of culture is not a new phenomenon. Through Theodore Adorno and Max Horkheimer, we know that culture, as separate from the market economy, was fading even in the early 20th century. And if we are to seize upon this phenomena of a democratizing cultural milieu, in order to build a stronger communal bond and to flatten social hierarchies, then it's essential to understand the paradoxes inherent in this challenge. With the rising cost of housing and physical retail in steep decline, what are the physical assets that will shape our experience of and in cities? What are the physical assets that will shape our experience and give added value of urbanism and city building in any discussion about a future egalitarian society? Can the city organize us in such a way as to make us more prepared for social compacts that demand that we see the other as a fellow equal? As culture becomes more mediated by film and televisual content, virtual reality, augmented reality, and artificial intelligence, asserting the primacy of physical personhood actually becomes all the more urgent. Without this basic register, personhood becomes indistinguishable from the virtual world. We have to be mindful that technology is not neutral. Its capacity to empower can be overshadowed by its capacity to dehumanize, whether through algorithms or embedded human intentionality. Now, the role of academia in cultural production. To create a more egalitarian world, to nurture forms of cultural democratization independent from the market, requires academia, and it requires the American university. The defining characteristic, in fact, of the American university is academic freedom and the democratic ideal of becoming an equalizer in terms of including every kind of person in the enterprise. In academia today, we face increased corporatization of the university, the chilling effect of trustees, university presidents, provosts, and even deans, catering to the elite private interests of a small, select group of influencers. The modern Research One University places the arts and architecture as marginal to the real core problem-solving mission of the university, implementized by business schools and engineering schools. Design thinking, a commodified version of architecture's signature feature of project-based design studio pedagogy, has eclipsed architecture as a more business-friendly avenue for creative students. We must resist intimidation, and we must insist that the university live up to the democratic ideals of its founding principles. Whose job is it to speak truth to power, to uphold the ethics of knowledge exchange with constituencies that can benefit from our know-how? Whose responsibility is it to build communities of mutual respect with the intention of flattening social hierarchies? In the past, this burden has fallen to the humanities and the social sciences, to nonprofits, enlightened individuals, and politicians. No single actor possesses the singular intellectual and cultural capital to enact change. And because the culture has turned towards a more visual, spatial, data-driven mentality, architecture now finds itself in a very unique position. At the nexus of theory, practice, the physical and virtual worlds, architecture has a unique capacity, operating as a discipline and as a profession, to step into this void. Cultural and academic institutions harbor biases and ideological blindnesses. Yet they are our best hope for expanding public discourse with intellectual rigor and integrity. And I, in fact, agree with Michael Hayes and his foundational assertion that, quote, architecture is central to the domains of cultural representation and is a signifying force in the processes of symbolic production, end quote. Architecture then can play a significant role in the emergent conversations on how culture is in fact produced, what its meaning is, and for whom it is produced. The role of architecture, praxis in cultural production. The praxis of architecture, the intertwined legacies of the discipline and profession, are currently at a turning point. The traditional architecture practice, defined by hierarchical and homogeneous staffs and catering to high net worth individuals, cultural and academic institutions, is becoming obsolete. The traditional single-family house, whether a tract house designed by a contractor or a McMansion designed by a star architect, will likely not withstand the twin pressures of planetary precarity and a recalibration of value placed on individual wealth versus the public good. Our cities, once thriving with retail promenades, local retail, and affordable mixed-income housing, will either become playgrounds for the 1% or be repurposed entirely. For some, I can't tell by the expressions of your faces, but for some, I've sketched out a dystopian future. For others, I've sketched out a frightening present. But how do we get here, and where do we go from here? Neil Smith, in Uneven Development, states, quote, deindustrialization and regional decline, gentrification and extra-metropolitan growth, the industrialization of the Third World and a new international division of labor, intensified nationalism, and a new geopolitics of war. These are not separate developments, but in fact symptoms of a much deeper transformation in the geography of capitalism, end quote. Architecture and urban design have participated, either by ignoring certain conditions as lying outside of their purview, or by being complicit with power to subjugate categories of persons within the urban realm and elsewhere. I cited the case of Detroit earlier. Now let's take the example of racial segregation, public housing, and new urbanism. The Kerner Commission report of 1967, the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, examined racial unrest in Newark, Detroit, New Brunswick, and other cities. The report stated that, quote, in 1910, 91% of the nation's 9.8 million Negroes lived in the South, and only 27% of American Negroes lived in cities of 2,500 persons or more. Between 1910 and 1966, the total Negro population more than doubled, reaching 21.5 million. And the number living in metropolitan areas rose more than fivefold, from 2.6 million to 14.8 million, end quote. The report recommended the immediate construction of 600,000 housing units in deprived ghetto neighborhoods. That didn't happen. As Elizabeth Hinton describes in her book, From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime, President Carter was the first to connect public housing with crime control measures. His Urban Initiatives anti-crime program was inspired by the Nixon and Ford administration's embrace of defensible space, concepts developed by architect Oscar Newman. Newman believed that social science indicated higher instances of criminality in high-rise buildings with particular kinds of residents, largely black and poor. The defensible space logic and the design outputs synergize nicely with their growing interest in replacing monies, resources, going towards social policy and housing, towards investment in surveillance and other insidious technologies aimed at curbing violence in high-crime areas. Does that sound familiar? Public housing, as we know, was built in this period of 1950s and 1960s, and most of it torn down in the 1990s and replaced with low-density townhomes, a direct result of the tremendous success of the new urbanist policies that infiltrated the Clinton administration, as well as a move back to the city by the upper middle class. This second iteration of urban renewal, if you like, cannibalized many black and brown neighborhoods and reclaimed so-called blighted areas such as Harlem and Oakland and areas of Chicago to house wealthier populations. The city became popular again. You know this. Gentrification accelerated, and the demographics of cities have shifted dramatically, much like what occurred with urban migration in the mid-1960s. We know this history, and we may blame planners for bad outcomes, but where was the architecture profession? Where was the discipline when all this was going on? Where was our collective voice? Today, in Los Angeles, we have over 60,000 homeless on the streets. New York and San Francisco are not very far behind. Evictions are at an all-time high. We have a full-blown housing crisis fueled by the after effects of the Great Recession and the financialization of housing, and a national deficit of millions of housing units with rent levels reaching record highs in the top 10 metros. No other single discipline has a skill set and intellectual acumen to approach these issues. Redesigning what justice means and how it is spatialized means doing more than running a design studio on homeless housing or getting a tax write-off for donations to a homeless shelter. Architects possess a unique capacity, if we choose to nurture it, and transform our institutions to address these challenges. In conclusion, architecture cannot solve these problems alone, nor can it or should it singularly exploit these as new opportunities. But if we use architecture and urban design of our time as a weapon in the arsenal of the common good, then we also have to commit to using our resources to flattening social hierarchies in concert with rethinking the distribution of our collective resources. Those are the tenets of a new egalitarianism. Not just redistribution of resources, but flattening the social hierarchies. At USC, we are using the term citizen architects to define individuals and collectives whose purpose-driven, impact-driven creative work empowers others and situates the architect as partner, advocate, and collaborator with the full spectrum of economic classes and diverse constituencies. Persons who are not constrained by their professional identities in speaking truth to power, and in fact, see their personal identities as inextricably connected to their professional identities. I recognize that many of you here are already doing this work, but the majority of our discipline is not engaged in a sustained systemic transformation of our institutions, our national professional organizations, our schools and institutes, our advocacy organizations, are not engaged in ways that foreground these issues and speak to the diversity that's needed to address them. The work of this organization and others to expand the public imagination on what cities, housing, and cultural experience could be is exemplary. But the efforts can often be disconnected from government, from practice, from academia, which can make change difficult to enact or sustain. So, translating our values into actions could mean some of the following items. Expanding architectural pedagogies and practices to be more multidisciplinary. recognizing that over 50% of our students in professional degree programs in the coming years will not enter traditional architectural practices and may never practice architecture in a purely traditional sense in the future. 30 to 40% today, it could be 50 or 60% in several years. Expanding schools of architecture to possess a theoretical, practical, and community-engaged component of their pedagogies that brings tacit knowledge from diverse communities, from the street, from constituencies directly outside, external to the academic enterprise, inside the academic enterprise, in the classroom, in the design studio. Rebuilding entire cities from single-family enclaves to denser urban environments where multiple economic classes are living side by side. This could mean redesigning a large proportion of some of our major cities. Rebuilding a social safety net that privileges public space and housing as core public rights with transformative regulation on rent, vacancy, and evictions. Rethinking the category of asset and asset classes that qualify as public goods, which may result in new uses of previously privatized land at a large scale. And finally, radically diversifying our schools, our design firms, and our institutions and leadership to respond to the massive epistemic exclusion suffered by our discipline, where whole categories of persons and identities are invisible from the impactful discourse that determines the design of a broad set of diverse communities. If you're already doing this work, I hope to have affirmed your truth and your work. If you're new to the perspective of seeing architecture as integral to the social construction and cultural production of our world, I hope to have opened your mind to new ways of thinking about your work. In the end, I believe that a new social compact, an updated version of egalitarianism with the input of architects, and a more socially conscious and politically conscious architectural community can have positive and productive implications for the whole of society. Thank you.
Would you be willing to take some questions?
Sure.
I would like to hear your perspective on how space affects culture and how culture affects the rest of us. Exactly. I would like to hear in detail how space affects our culture, not as, an individual, but collectively. How we interact with each other and everything that leads from there.
Thank you. Good question. I think what I was trying to frame for you this evening is the fact that, first of all, culture has expanded from the kind of elite definition of the opera and the museum to a much broader set of experiences and circumstances.
Art as well.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. That are available to a broader set of constituencies. But that doesn't mean in and of itself that culture is democratized. So, because part of democratization, part of cultural experience, we could say, is some notion of the collective. If you're on your phone, gaming or something and not really connected to other people, is that really a cultural interaction? It might be a product of a creative mind, television or artist or architect, but is that a cultural collective interaction? So the fact of making collectivity, a particular kind of collectivity, a threshold to cultural interaction that's separate from the market. That, I think, developing definitions of true cultural interaction separate from the market is actually quite difficult today because we're all connected to market-based areas. So I think that's one formulation that I would like us to think about and try to aspire to, instead of accepting that advertising and people selling us stuff it's all just melded together and we accept that. So taking a more critical, personal, and collective approach to actually using culture as a protective against a subsumption of everything into a market economy. So I think that's one way to think about culture. And the other way is, you could take my articulations today and say, well, can I use culture instead of some of the official institutional mechanisms to flatten social hierarchies, to make you and I equals as opposed to the status that we assume you have or I have in talking, amongst ourselves or anybody in this room. So the idea that the idea of citizenship and citizens means we all at one level are equal, billionaires and somebody who's not a billionaire. So could flattening social hierarchies also be another threshold by which you say we're trying to develop a culture that actually wants to make that a basic condition of great cultural experience?
Well, what about this room? What about this room? This room itself has a culture. Do you agree? I feel as if the culture is created by the space itself that allows people to interact in a certain way. If this was an enclosed space, we probably wouldn't even be speaking right now, like on the train.
Sure. I think, spaces are a reflection of our intentions as architects, right? So where the chairs are placed, where the podium is placed, where the benches are, all of that is part of the intentionality of architecture. And that's something that we own and we should own as the makers of that space. So thank you. Appreciate it.
Hi, I have a question about your discussion around redistribution of resources and flattening hierarchies. In terms of education, I'm in education. There are schools that are supposed to provide that possibility in terms of undergraduate, graduate schools.
Mhm.
This is what most people do. They go to these institutions to allow themselves to have that possibility. But then, upon graduation and going out into the real world, that kind of distribution does not happen in terms of flattening those hierarchies does not actually happen. And resources are not really provided open to those who have come from various different cultural communities.
Sure.
How do you expect, or what ideas do you have about that graduation level after that possibility of graduate and undergraduate programs? Where does that go? Where's the trajectory for those who have been educated now to then have those possibilities? Because I see that's where it drops off quite a lot in terms of education. You have been educated just like anyone else in fine schools, but then their opportunities are not available to them after that.
Mhm. Very quickly, to speak to kind of architecture, which is the space of the world that I inhabit. I think that traditional, there is a lot of consolidation in our industry around very large architecture firms consuming other medium-sized firms and smaller firms. I think our graduates are just as likely to work for, and in the future will be just as likely to work for an NGO like the Ford Foundation as they would be to work in an architecture firm. And I think for some that's a loss of talent in our industry, but I think the flip side of that is that we can penetrate every other work sphere with the skill sets that we have and actually begin to use that creative thinking in ways that might be non-conventional, and also begin to start and see kind of 1,000 flowers blooming in terms of the type of new design practices that will emerge with collectives of students who come out of school, some of them from architecture, some from real estate, some from, anthropology, and begin to form very different kinds of organisms that we will call practices, very different from what the status quo has been in the field up to now, broadly speaking. So I think that's one area. I think, there's within academia, we have hierarchies, and we have, the challenge of flattening social hierarchies, even between students. 20% of my undergraduates are first generation to go to college. And so we have, tremendous diversity that we're fortunate to have, but that creates tensions within those students in terms of simple things like, paying $4 for a Starbucks coffee with a friend and knowing that your mom back home, who made a lot of sacrifices for you to be here, is working 2 jobs. So that kind of split screen that our students are experiencing is real. And I think far too few faculty realize that the demographic of students is not, not everyone is wealthy, and not everyone is coming from the same place. And so that is something that we're dealing with and struggling with in academia within architecture schools.
I'm from Finland originally, and studied in London after I worked with the Rolling Stones for a couple of years.
Oh, wow.
Which was the most level society imaginable. It did not matter where you came from, what you did, if you played well or recorded well, in my case recorded. We were equal. But in architecture in London, our primary function in the school where I went was to find ways to do housing and architecture that would serve the society. And we found, well, my professors had found Holland as the primary example of try the most. And as the 70s rolled on, we found that even Holland could not change human beings as wished, as you well stated in your beautiful letter. It's just so difficult, even with the best of intentions, to have a collective understanding how to make the society richer, like we did in music, and like in this country, jazz has created our country as black and white as we think of. So this is the first lecture in 40 years that I've been in this country that I admire in the sense that you have established the talking points that we should do, but cannot do.
I hope many people in this room will prove you wrong. I think that what I mean to suggest is that I think the work, there's great work being done, but the scale of the issues that we're facing are much larger than the proportion of us who are doing this work with a high level of intentionality. And the architecture in general is always faces a kind of existential marginalization with respect to capital and technology and the control of, and power relative to building buildings and building real estate, and how real estate has become more financialized since 1980s. On the one hand, makes bigger scale projects possible, but again, the cyclical keeping up with neighborhoods that are being cannibalized and then other places for those people is very challenging. So I hope that that everyone in this room will prove you wrong, and you as well will prove us wrong. So
Let's continue this conversation upstairs.
thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.